People Not Titles podcast is brought to you by Land Trust Title Services, your partners for results. Well, hello. This is a People Not Titles podcast, Market Trends Weekly Edition.
Boom.
And it is June 3rd?
June 3rd.
June 3rd. Let's go. So, Matt, first off, we have news from the NAR.
So, yes, NAR is, as we discussed in our last episode, they are meeting in Washington, D.C. this week for their legislative meetings. And right before the meetings, they announced 2 key staff positions being filled. This is part of the litany of new staff at NAR. So 2 gentlemen, one named Bennett Richardson is now the Senior Vice President of Marketing Communications. My old job at one time. Tough shoes to fill.
They lost a good one. They lost a good one.
He actually replaces someone else, and I don't remember her name, who was in there for about a year or less.
Okay.
So a little churn in that area. It's a tough position.
Well, it reminds me, Matt, of the Lou Brock trade.
Oh, man.
We got Lou Brock, and no one knows who he was traded for.
I knew, and I can't remember his name. That's a good trivia question.
Yes. Though. Okay. Someone knows. If you know, you can put a comment in.
So Bennett Richardson's the new SVP of Marketing Communications, and a gentleman named Rafi Williams is their new VP of Communications. Like I said, these were just announced. They started on May 31st, so that was their official day. So I'm sure they're making their debut in Washington, D.C., mixing and mingling with the 8,000 plus attendees. Bennett has nearly 2 decades of experience in public affairs, media, technology, and has held roles at Semaphore, Google, and Politico Media Group, which is good for the politically connected NAR. And Rafi has a background in public affairs, media strategy, financial communications, previously served for the Managing Funds Association, Edelman Smithfield, and some federal agencies like FHFA and HUD.
So, Matt, so I see this as sweeping out the old leadership, moving in new leadership. What's your take on this?
So the new CEO made permanent not that long ago, Nikia Wright.
From the Sun-Times?
From the Sun-Times. She is now creating the organization with her as the true leader.
Okay.
So this is not unusual for any organization where you get new leadership.
New head coach, you get the new
head
assistant coaches.
Absolutely. So new head coach looking to do things differently. So a lot of the, what I would say, old timers are no more.
So Matt, how long do you think Nikia Wright gets with this new team before people determine that this is a winning or losing proposition?
Good question. I don't know.
Okay.
They're
under a lot of pressure.
A lot of pressure, and there's high expectations, especially in terms of marketing communications, public relations, and media.
Mm-hmm.
So those are big, high-pressure areas. I know that for a fact. And with the bad publicity that NAR has received over the last 2+ years, it's time for a change. So,
okay,
it's time.
It's a good sign that they're changing.
It's a good sign, and we'll see how long they last.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like I said, they've cycled through some leadership, some senior leadership on the staff level. So we'll see. But yeah, so she's shaping the organization based on member feedback, her own leadership, and this is the direction they're going in.
Matt, there's a story, segueing, there's a story that we've had our eye on for quite a while. Tanya Monastier, who, Matt, is also following me on Twitter. So if you're not following me on Twitter, I mean, it's just like a main follow.
One of the hundreds of thousands of followers that Steve has.
Absolutely.
But yes, Tanya is very important.
And we have been in communication with Tanya, and we could have her on our People Not Titles podcast, but that will be after the smoke clears on this. And I've talked to a lot of realtors, and they don't know about this story, which is that Tanya had, why don't you take the story, Matt?
No, I mean, Tanya has been an advocate of sort of the opposite view of why is this lawsuit, why did it happen, why is it continued to happen, and has voiced her opinion through legal briefs in the court system and in other avenues of saying this whole thing should be thrown out, and the only people who've benefited from this are the attorneys representing the plaintiffs.
Yes.
The industry really has not changed. Realtors have changed their practice, but commissions have not gone down. So who has ultimately benefited from this lawsuit? The answer is probably no one on the consumer, home buyer, seller side, and it's only enriched the plaintiff's attorneys. So that is where she's gone and continues to advocate for that.
And Matt, I did hear that the firm Sitzer Burnett, this group also is formed a brokerage that is offering um, just a simple flat fee listings. So
Seriously?
yes,
Okay,
so that's another thing. That might be a rumor, and that's okay, allegedly. So the point is that it seems to me, just from looking at this, that Tanya is actually doing the job that the NAR could have done from the beginning, but didn't do, or that I think agents expected advocacy from the NAR. And Tanya saying, hey, only attorneys benefited, sellers didn't benefit, and there's a lot more to the story. We're going to keep our eye on it. The final briefs are due July 1st, with a court decision possibly arriving in 2026, which could unwind
right.
the whole mess.
And we sort of
So I
talked
hope they
about
squirreled away that money, Matt, because they may have to give it back.
we're going to find out, and it just keeps getting more complicated and convoluted of this whole lawsuit and where it may ultimately wind up. And we've talked about this before. The department, and we're going to talk about this in our final story of this episode, but I'll just give a sneak peek. The Department of Justice under the previous administration is going to be completely different than the Department of Justice under the current administration.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that will change the relationship and what happens moving forward, at least for the next 3.5 years, of what happens with NAR.
Matt, and something that has come up in every one of our conversations that I've had with really professional brokers that are still in the business is that they're unfazed. They have never doubted their value and have still continued to articulate it in a way that the consumer says, I'm happy to pay for the service you've given.
Yep.
And so I think if you're a top professional agent, if you're on your game, if you are adding value to the consumer, you are safe.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes, yes, yes. Okay, Matt. Buyers, sellers hit snags under new anti-gentrification ordinance. Who would have thought this would have happened with the Northwest Ordinance? So tell us what the Northwest Ordinance is and what's happening.
So we talked about this on a few previous episodes, and this is an update.
And we've had Mark Cervantes comment on it, and several others on our podcast just say this is just going to be ridiculous.
In order, it's the city. There's so many things to unravel with this, but the Northwest Side Housing Preservation Ordinance went into effect on March 1st, and in essence gives renters the first right of refusals if they're living in a building in certain parts of the near Northwest Side of Chicago, that instead of the owner selling to a developer, which has happened and has really driven up prices and put out a lot of people, long-term residents, who had lived in this community, they can't afford to live there anymore.
Yes.
So the intent is, okay, how do we stop all these investors, developers coming in to Logan Square, Bucktown, Ukrainian Village, parts of Logan Square, where real estate is valuable now, and
Yes.
the long-term residents can't do it. So we're going to create this Northwest Side Housing Preservation Ordinance. But it's, as we've talked about, it's just a cluster because there's no guidance. The intent may be good, but at the back end, it's created so many problems, and some of them include mortgage financing challenges and title complications.
So who would have thought that mortgage companies and title companies are having a hard time backing these or insuring these? Is that right?
Correct. So, for example, Fannie Mae will not back loans on properties with right of first refusal clauses. This reduces the number of buyer pool and favors large institutional investors.
So that it's doing the exact opposite of what it was intended, which now big money, hard money, private finance, and all that, which most of the little guy or gal cannot have access to. Now, those are going to be the players in this pool.
Potentially, to me, it's going to be just like the commission lawsuit. What's going to change? Not much, except now things are harder.
Wow. And let's talk about Chicago Title and Fidelity. What's their posture?
So what's happening with some of the larger title companies and underwriters, Chicago Title, Fidelity being two of them, they're charging extra fees for properties in this zone of the Northwest Side Ordinance because of added risk, paperwork, and increasing closing costs, because it's harder to close on these properties for timing and all the other things that go on to it. So Title insurers are concerned about the legal ambiguity, as tenants who haven't waived their rights must file a lawsuit after the sale. Once again,
Might still file.
might
So if
still
you
file.
haven't waived your
Yep.
rights and they sell that property anyway, or the
Correct.
paperwork isn't done right, next thing you know, you have this boogeyman in the bushes where there's going to be attorneys waiting in the weeds saying, hey, you were cheated out of your opportunity, and now you're going to file lawsuits, and now the new owners have to think about, am I going to have things creeping up on me? And so, no, the title insurance company is going to have to try to insure those things, and they're going to say, we don't want to protect against those type of things. It's going to be more expensive.
In sum, our fine city of Chicago officials have acknowledged the issues, and they are working on the solutions to resolve these concerns. So I'm eager to see what the city does, what will ultimately happen. But because I am born, raised, and still reside in the city of Chicago, my hunch is this is not front and center, and things will languish for a little while. But we will be here to report all new stuff that's happening.
Matt, do you think, okay, let's just predict here, do you think they'll put a pause on this Northwest Ordinance?
I hope they strike it from the record like it never existed, because I really don't think the end result is going to benefit anybody. And the developers and investors are going to continue to develop and invest, and there may be alternatives that the city could look at to limit that. Perhaps they can buy the properties if they want to create long-term lower income or affordable housing in those areas. But because the city has no money, I know they will not.
Yeah.
So anyway, there's a lot to go on here. All I can say is when the city bureaucracy gets involved with certain things, this is what happens.
Wow. All right, Matt. So where small brokerages...
Hey, thanks for listening to the People Not Titles podcast. We are brought to you by our great sponsors, Land Trust Title Services, your partners for results.
Small brokerages have an edge over the giants. And when we're talking about small brokerages, we're talking about not the national big boys. Who would be, in your mind, a national big boy? Caldwell Banker, Compass.
Caldwell Banker.
Yes.
I mean, Remax is a franchise
Yes.
brand. I mean,
Keller.
Yeah, so those are the bigger franchises that have their branding, and they're in most states, Canada, other countries perhaps. Smaller regional brokerages would be like Lennox Scott in Seattle area, a Baird Warner here in Chicago, Howard Hanna Realty in Ohio, Long and Foster on the East Coast. So those would be the more large independent brokerage models. And then you have obviously
the small,
the 2, 3, 4, 5 to 10 brokerage office that's serving a select community, a zip code, whatever it may be. So that's how I would define versus large versus small brokerages.
So let's talk about the small brokerages and where there's a perceived or a real edge for the consumer and for agents.
So I'll start with a Compass, a Caldwell Banker. And consolidation, as we've talked about, it's going to continue to happen. So the big keep on getting bigger by swallowing up and acquiring smaller regional companies.
Compass buying here or nationwide, but primarily they were big in Chicago.
Correct. Compass also bought, I think we talked about Ladder and Bloom, which is a New Orleans-based, smaller brokerage. So they have purchased them. So the big keep getting bigger. They're going to look to acquire brokerages, teams, etc. But there are advantages to the smaller brokerages, like a Baird and Warner here in Chicago, where some of the advantages are you're nimble, you're quicker, you're not tied to the corporate overlord.
Yeah, and what might be good for your area or nationwide in a strategy might not be good for your nuanced market.
Right, and so like a Compass, for example, they're looking, they're a publicly traded company, so they're looking to maximize shareholder value, and they may not care that their institutionalized system across the country of who knows what it could be, a technology, and how they process paperwork or how they integrate things. It could work, say, in San Francisco, but it's not going to work here in Chicago as well.
Right.
But that's how they operate. They're going to operate, we're going to save money, we're going to make more money.
Yeah.
Whereas Baird and Warner, for example, you know, 5, 6 generation family run company here in Chicago, well known, well respected, and people like that. You know, consumers have, and this is part of this article that we're referring to, is consumers have a better perception and feeling towards a locally owned, family owned, part of the community. You know, using Baird and Warner as an example, they are very involved in the community from charitable events, you know, staying here, being a part of the community.
Yeah.
Whereas a Compass, they're part of the community, but they're not part of the community.
Yeah,
And they don't have the vested interest in the local community like that.
You know, Matt, it makes me think of companies in our area. I think of John Green. I do think of Baird and Warner. I think of Fulton Grace in the city. They have a certain niche and a certain edge. I think of, you know, Berkshire Hathaway Stark. I think of, you know, there's many others, Independence Realty, down in Chicago. The name escapes my, Realty Chicago, I believe.
Okay.
And, you know, and I think about our market. Gold Coast is different than Lincoln Park, is different than Highland Park, is different than Naperville. And so to make decisions nationwide for nuanced markets, even in our, you know, what we would call the metro area, I could see that there's a disadvantage to that. So the trust, the culture, how agents feel supported, smaller brokerages, I believe there'll always be a place for them. And the bigger the big ones get, the more power I think the smaller brokerages will have to provide that community feel and whatever it is to agents and to buyers and sellers.
And so for you agents out there, whether you're working for a Compass or a Baird and Warner, as long as you're happy, comfortable, and pleased with who you're working for from a company perspective and how you are serving your clients, that's the biggest thing.
Yeah.
You know, because I know for a fact there are many agents that seek out to work at a place like John Green, a Stark, a Baird and Warner, because of the values, the culture, the small family feel, as well as the nimbleness and the attention that they give to the agents from a better perspective versus the large players.
Yeah, and Matt, on a point counterpoint thing, if you are working for these large kind of national brokerages, I'm sure there's advantages and there's a reason why you're there, but I still think it's important to differentiate yourself, to get involved in that community and to be known. I met a gal from Keller Williams over the weekend, and she was talking about how, you know, she's working in Barrington, and she's talking about how she's really made a name for herself in Barrington. So she's kind of independent of her brand and created her own brand, which I think that is the most valuable thing you could do as a salesperson or a personality or whatever it is, start to create your own brand. Okay, the U.S. housing market, this is a Redfin story, Matt.
This is a Redfin report that a lot of people are talking about, and so we're going to talk about it too.
Okay, they say there's nearly 500,000 more sellers than buyers. Now, is this a flip of the script, Matt, where we were talking about inventory being an issue and all this? Now, boom, this is a surprising story, and it does say that will likely cause home prices to drop. So let's talk about that.
So once again, there's a Redfin report. Steve just read the headlines. So as of April 2025, there's approximately 1.9 million home sellers and 1.5 million home buyers in the U.S. So sellers are outnumbering buyers by almost 34%, or about 490,000 more sellers than buyers. So yes, this is a nation. So just for our viewers and listeners out there, this is the U.S. on the whole.
Total.
And so what's skewing this are two outliers, Florida and Texas. So this is, and plus the condo market, which we'll talk about. So this is the largest imbalance on record since record keeping began in 2013. And it's driven up by high home prices and higher mortgage rates. And Redfin, and I think we talked about this and that, we're going to say it, Redfin predicts a 1% year-over-year drop in home prices by the end of this year.
Okay.
Which I think we've talked about. Yeah. Things will ultimately level off, at least on a nationwide basis here in the Chicago marketplace.
We're still seeing rising prices.
Still seeing rising prices, and I think by the end of the year, it will be higher year over year. That's my opinion. Just because Chicago marketplace, the Midwest typically lags behind everybody else in the country. It's a slower, steadier growth. It's the tortoise winning the race versus the hare.
Yeah, and so it's a stable market, and I think we've tracked that inventory is kind of flat in Chicagoland so far. I think we're going to see an uptick here now, but this is, as you mentioned, primarily driven by unique special scenarios and markets.
So yeah, like I said, and you said the two outliers, Florida and Texas.
Mm-hmm.
Florida, for those of you, and I know many people have second, maybe third properties in the Florida marketplace with home insurance, with the condos that are, the ones that fell a couple years ago.
Yes.
And I know that there is a big interest now in laws being enacted where all of these older condominiums are getting inspected.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, you need to fix this so that
Association fees are going up,
association
and
fees,
insurance fees are going up.
right. So those two big drivers, people are like, I can't afford to keep this anymore. And they're, the high prices that people expect, they're not going to get anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot more inventory in that. And then the last bullet point is condo markets are particularly oversupplied with almost 84% more sellers than buyers.
Wow.
So that makes sense on the topics we just talked about.
Fantastic. And our final story is the NAR was doing a talk. This is an Inman story. And the bottom line was that the synthesis of it was the Department of Justice, there's a perception that brokers are making too much.
So this is hot off the press. Inman is sitting in the rooms right now in Washington, D.C., capturing what's happening. Mm-hmm. So this is an article that just came out today. And in essence, the Justice Department, so this is a broker committee, what is it called? NAR's Broker Engagement Council. Mm. And the current president, Kevin Sears, was invited to address the crowd. So these are brokers from across the country, and they shared their concerns with him in a little Q&A session. And one of the concerns was, it seems to be like the Department of Justice treats us like a dog with a bone, and it doesn't seem to be going away. If we have such good advocacy relationships with our legislators, and we do such a good job there, why does that not transfer over to here? Mm-hmm. And so, in essence, President Sears says it's related but not related, and the Department of Justice has been on us like a dog on a bone, but we're working on a better relationship right now. According to Sears, NAR has had a rocky relationship with the Department of Justice last year, in part because NAR had been suing the agency for the previous 4 years over the settlement agreement, and ultimately that went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court did not hear it, so everything stood as is. Sears told attendees that he had met with the Department of Justice twice in D.C., and there was a clear lack of understanding of how we do business by some of the people in that room, which makes sense.
Yes.
Unless you're in the day-to-day business of real estate, you think you know what it is. And so one of the things that they said is, you, no offense, realtors, are your own worst enemy, because the Department of Justice is watching social media and listening to podcasts and seeing what you're saying and how you're positioning yourselves. And I think what they're saying is real estate celebrates and showcases the Hollywood celebrity agents. Mm-hmm. Whereas the vast majority of you out there are not working on multi-million-dollar mansions on the seaside.
Right.
You're working in your neighborhoods. You're working with first-time homebuyers.
That's right.
And so the perception out there by the Department of Justice is that all of you are making millions of dollars and doing millions and millions and millions of dollars in transactions, and you're making too much money. And so that was the joke that President Sears said is, why are they still investigating us? And he said, they think we make too much money. We may, and I'll quote him, we make too much money. That's it. I said I represent 1.5 million entrepreneurs who choose to wake up unemployed every day, but it's through their hard work by representing their clients and consumers that they can earn a living. So I would agree.
Yeah. You know, Matt, you want my perspective on it?
We always want your perspective on it.
So my perspective is this, that you as a professional are selling the most valuable asset of an individual. And I believe you're worth every dollar that you're getting. And I think that this whole settlement, this whole conversation has really brought that to bear, that the good ones are staying, and the ones that just think I'm going to get in and make a quick buck, they have fallen out, proving that it is not a quick buck. It does take a professional to get that dollar, and you have every right to that money when you're helping someone make a move the emotional decision, large ticket transaction. I believe it's here to stay. And so that's my prediction, man.
Yes. Thank you for your perspective.
Yeah.
So this is, as Steve alluded to, because of, we'll say, popularity,
Yeah.
groundswell,
Yeah.
but most of all, because and we sort of joked about this, is there's so much news, we need to do this weekly. But the
Yes.
reality is, there is so much news, there is so much interest in viewers and listeners that we are going to start this on a weekly basis.
Yep.
So it will not be as long. It'll be more quick hitting.
Yep.
It'll be more real time
Yep.
information. So you don't have to wait once a month. You're going to hear it weekly.
Yep. And so we would ask you, in support of us, like, subscribe, and share. And we will see you next week.
Take care.
People Not Titles podcast, signing off.
Hey, thanks for listening to the People Not Titles podcast. We are proudly sponsored by Land Trust Title Services. If you enjoyed the podcast, please hit the like button, please subscribe, and we'd love it if you'd share our podcast with your friends. Thanks a lot.